Hello again, and welcome to Bigfoot for Breakfast, home of the mysterious and the macabre, where we sit in the studio every week challenging conventional thought. We are your hosts, Sarah Jones
and Samantha Carter.
We've got a couple of things to talk about before we get started on this week's show. This is the last episode before we wrap up our Twitter contest. So if you haven't already, all you have to do is go onto Twitter and retweet Bigfoot for Breakfast. If you do this, then you will automatically be entered into a contest in which you can win either a t-shirt or an insulated coffee mug with our logo on it. We're going to be picking out 2 winners this time, and the drawing will be held via Facebook Live on January 31st.
If you haven't already, don't forget to push the subscribe button on whichever podcast platform you're listening from, and if you have a few minutes, leave us a rating and a review. Several of you have done so already, and we appreciate that tremendously because it helps us out so much, and we need all the help we can get.
Yes, we do.
You can also call into the show now, and our number here is 641-812-2634. Call us up and leave a message, and we will put it on the next episode. Make sure you leave a first name and where you're from. Let us know what you like or what you don't like about the show. Make a show suggestion or just say hey. Either way, we'd love to hear from any of you guys. And for all of you introverted people out there, the call will go straight to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about us actually answering.
That's right. You don't have to talk to anyone.
I definitely wouldn't call if I had to talk to somebody.
I wouldn't either. So we want to take a second to thank a listener who emailed us this past week by the name of Wes. Wes is an Air Force veteran, and we thank you for your service, first of all. He emailed us to let us know that he really liked the show, and he totally stole our hearts by complimenting the research that we do and the detail of the show, because this is something that we work very hard on every week, and we really appreciated that. A lot of the stories that we do, you can find a lot of them on the internet, but mostly only shorter versions without the chronological detail that we try to provide here on our show. So we do a lot of digging around in the newspaper archives, books, and other sites to put the story all together into an episode that is 45 minutes to an hour long. And it takes a lot of work, but we really love doing it.
And we also really love compliments.
Give me compliments. Give me compliments.
I want all the attention and stop TikToking on our podcast.
I love TikToks.
Stop it.
Addicted. Wes also pointed us to a problem that we were already kind of aware of, but he let us know as well, which prompted us to make a few improvements. Our audio had been pretty uneven and very quiet before, so if you notice the audio quality being a little bit better this episode, you can thank Wes, because we have hopefully fixed this problem that we are having. If we haven't, please let us know. We went into this podcast thing super green on the audio front, and although we've learned a lot, some things needed addressed, and we hope that you guys will let us know anytime something needs corrected, because we really do read our emails and we consider the feedback that we get. So thank you to Wes very much for the email this week, and we are really glad that you like the show.
We also want to take a few minutes to let you in on some recommendations that we have for some other shows. If you're looking for something else to listen to, we know a few that may pique your interest. The Question Everything guys, we talk about them quite a bit here on our show. Semperfi Rob, Sean, and the Mick host a show where they pick a different topic every week that usually seems to coincide with issues that we seem to be facing at the time as American people, and they discuss it. It's cool to listen to down-to-earth regular people talk about things that we're all concerned about and hear their take on things. They usually do a Facebook Live every Saturday, and then they'll post the edited version to the podcast platforms a few days later. They also take call-ins from guests who have anything to say regarding the topic that week. So if you can relate in some way or have an opinion, get on their Facebook Live and give them a call and chat them up for a while.
MWP is another show that you guys should check out. Chach and Josh are funny and their conversations flow really well. They talk a lot about movies, wrestling, politics, whatever else comes up through the episode, with a lot of jokes and a lot of great personality. They have a lot of really great points and topics, so check them out. You won't regret it.
Eventually, you guys might pick up that I'm a little bit of a wrestling nerd myself, so I'm kind of a fan of the show.
I am not a wrestling nerd, and I'm still a fan of the show.
The Kensington Corner with Tom and Jeff is another great show. They tackle the problems of the world one thing at a time, but they focus a lot on health and overall well-being, both mentally and physically, from a man's standpoint. And we found their show to be really interesting because they aren't afraid to really get into the everyday struggles that guys face, especially with mental health and stress. It's a really honest show, and one of them is a veteran, so they promote various causes associated with the mental health of veterans as well, which we think is incredible because it's a very important topic and our nation's veterans don't get the love and support that they deserve. So, any conversation that can be had about how to improve that is fantastic. Also, they announced that they had just been voted on top 150 podcasts in the U.S., so congratulations to them on that.
Isn't that for Apple?
For Apple, yeah.
Apple Podcasts. So that's awesome. Good job, Kensington Corner. And last but not least, check out a show called Altered Thought. Sean and Simplify Rob from the Kiwi guys have kind of branched out, and they actually started another show, and it's a little bit different from their original Kiwi guys show. Less conversation and debate and more education and facts on some really great subjects. So if you're just into learning a whole lot of new and interesting things, check them out because they do some good research on subjects that always keep our interest, and they talk a lot about things that aren't discussed every day. They've got episodes out on DMT, the human soul, and they just did one on Mary Magdalene. And last night, they just released one on the simulation theory. So that one was really cool too.
So those are our recommendations for you. All of these shows are really good and the hosts are all friendly, really cool, everyday people who are fun and entertaining to listen to. And if you want to find them all in one centralized location along with us here at Bigfoot for Breakfast, go on to Facebook and check out the Attitude Podcast Network. Like the page and you'll be updated on new episodes from all of these shows as well as any Facebook contests, live episodes, or whatever they are up to. So with that being said, let's get on with the show.
Let's.
Shall we?
This week, we've got a good one for you. I'm pretty sure that everyone throughout America has heard of the Rockefeller family. They're a pretty well-known fixture here and one of the wealthiest families in the world. In 1870, John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil, which ended up being the dominant company within the oil industry, and he was the first billionaire in America. Having established his family's immense wealth, his descendants went on to do big things also, which included numerous huge real estate and construction projects throughout New York City. His son, John Rockefeller Jr., built the Rockefeller Center. John Rockefeller III built the Lincoln Center, which is now one of the world's most prestigious performing arts venues. David Rockefeller, along with the Port Authority of New York, built the World Trade Center buildings, and he also founded One Chase Manhattan Plaza when he was the president of Chase Manhattan Bank. The Museum of Modern Art was an idea of Abby Aldridge Rockefeller, and it's now the largest collection of modern art in the world. Their influence in New York, America, and the world can't be denied.
Nelson Rockefeller was a grandson of John D. Rockefeller, and he was a prominent businessman who eventually was elected governor of New York in 1958. He was an art collector who always stated that he loved primitive art, collected it, and admired it, not for its intellectual value as his interest was purely aesthetic, which basically means he didn't know anything about the art that he collected, he just thought it was pretty.
It was gorgeous.
Nelson was married twice throughout his life and fathered 7 children. He had Rodman, Steve, Ann, Nelson Jr., Mark, and then a set of twins, Mary and Michael. And this is where the focus of our episode lies, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to talk to you specifically about one of these children, Michael. He's surprisingly one of the lesser-known Rockefellers whose story turned out to be by far one of the most interesting and strange.
I always thought it was so weird that this wasn't a more popular story.
Definitely macabre.
I had no idea that this happened before I read it. I mean, I only read this maybe a year ago.
They probably don't want that to be part of their legacy. You know what I mean?
No, but it's so interesting.
I know.
But it is terribly sad. Michael Rockefeller seems to have been universally described as a very outgoing, adventurous, and ambitious guy. He attended Harvard University, as was family tradition. He graduated magna cum laude in 1961. His parents were the co-founders of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and Michael had grown up absolutely surrounded by beautiful art and learning about it his entire life. When he was 18, they opened another museum, the Museum of Primitive Art, and I'm pretty sure that Michael, upon its opening, he was already on the board. So I didn't put that in here, but he went into it a board member. Michael and his father shared the love for this particular art together, and they admired things that came from entirely new worlds that Americans knew very little about, aside from what was read in a magazine here and there, and now what was housed in the museum. Michael's love and curiosity for this way of life grew and grew, and he longed to be a part of this in a more direct way. He loved the idea of travel and adventure to faraway places, but his place in his family seemed to be established. He was expected to join the family line of business and finance and pursue other interests such as art on the side.
But Michael wasn't satisfied with that. He was different than they were. He was strong, quiet, artistic, and adventurous. He felt the tug of the world and wasn't ready to surrender his life and freedom to banking and real estate offices. He did get his degree, though, so when he was ready for that life, it would be there for him, and he would be ready.
Right after graduating from 4 long years at Harvard, Michael decided to go on a little trip. A friend from college said that he was anxious to do something new, something that he had never done before, and he wanted to bring a major collection to New York. He had heard that there was a film crew from Harvard that would be traveling to Papua New Guinea to film a documentary on one of the local isolated tribes in the area. Michael jumped at this chance for adventure, asking if he could come along. The crew took him on as a sound technician and a still photographer, and Michael was set. He was going. But the trip had an ominous air about it from the beginning, and the wheels of dark fate seemed to be turning. A quote from Terry Pratchett states, "Light thinks it travels faster than anything, but it is wrong. No matter how fast light travels, it finds the darkness has always gotten there first and is waiting for it."
Dun, dun, dun.
That was an ominous quote.
I really like that quote.
It's not bad. Thank you, Terry Pratchett.
I would like to get into the kind of geographic lay of the land here in Dutch New Guinea at the time that Michael was there, and basically how it still looks today without all of the industrial influence that we have in modern America. The vast expanse of the land is basically jungle with tons and tons of interconnecting rivers that the people here use for travel and fishing. Being an island, the river system is directly fed by the ocean, and there is so much water here that the layout of the island completely depends on the tide at the moment. The tidal change in water levels changes it by around 20 feet at any given time, which is huge. At low tide, the island is basically swampy and fields of mud are seen for miles. At high tide, the island is flooded with small islands dotting around the area, and these higher elevation areas on the island are where the various tribal villages are.
Yeah.
That's
how it be. Remember, Michael was from New York City. He was born and raised there his entire life, among the concrete and the skyscrapers, along with the overpopulation and smog. It's said that upon reaching Papua New Guinea, he wrote in his journal, "Now this is wild and somehow more remote country than I have ever seen before. I can only imagine how he felt, arriving at a place like this. I imagine Michael being enamored with the absolutely beautiful purity of the place. The clean air and the sounds of birds and flowing water everywhere were probably overwhelming to him as his sense of adventure and excitement for this entirely new experience grew and grew inside of him. As I talk about it, I feel a major kinship with Michael because we both share this love for adventure, new places and new people, and I can almost feel what he was feeling at the time, which makes his story even more tragic to me."
There are various photos of Michael and his time on the island in which he looks to be having the time of his life. He's interacting with the locals and children here, exchanging gifts and smiles. He's laughing. He looks happy, excited, and interested. He looks like he fit right in with them, and they look to be friendly people. But like we said earlier, Michael's interest was art mostly. His goal was to bring home a collection of tribal art from the area to be displayed in the museum in New York, and he had found out about another village on the southwest side of the island, a village that housed a tribe called the Asmat. The art from these people was absolutely perfect. It was beautiful and intricate in its detail, and had great meaning to its people. Michael found himself drawn to this, and as the documentary filming came to a close, he resolved to go there and visit the people of the Asmat village and see for himself.
Michael traveled to a village called Amadasep. Now keep in mind that this culture had been carefully preserved in the rarely traveled area of Papua New Guinea, and the Asmat tribe was very isolated. The area at the time was actually Dutch New Guinea, and the Dutch government had been in and out a little bit, seeing what they might need to do in the area to pacify the people, since the villages in the area were constantly at war with one another. But even so, very few people of the tribe had ever seen a Westerner, and now suddenly there was one in their midst and they weren't really sure about him.
Michael was friendly, outgoing, possibly even overwhelming at first. And the Asmat were historically not the friendly, smiling type of people that he had been dealing with for the documentary. They were very serious, suspicious even. But they did welcome him in to intermingle with them for a time, and they didn't seem to be dangerous. They were very intelligent people, really, probably from having lived for generations in this desolate land and figuring things out on their own. The buildings were well designed, everything was very functional, and a lot of things that they had made and built were very mathematically challenging. Writer Carl Hoffman tells us that the Asmat language is so complex that it has 17 tenses. I think that's more than I've ever heard of in any other language. English and Spanish have 3 main tenses, and I think German and Slavic get up a little bit higher, but I still think it's only around 5 or 6, but I'm not entirely sure.
They let him check out their amazing and beautiful art and even buy some from them. He made a deal with them that he would be back to get it after the documentary wrapped up. What Michael had purchased were wooden poles that were about 20 feet tall, and they had been intricately hand-carved. You guys should look up these poles on the internet, because for them being hand-carved with fashioned knives and weaponry, they're amazing in their detail. These poles are extremely significant because they serve in a ritual that the Asmat people would perform in order to ward off or rid the village of evil spirits.
So, we need to get off the subject of Michael for just a minute and talk about the Asmat people and how they view death and spirituality. We got a lot of this information about them from a book entitled Savage Harvest by Carl Hoffman. And we'll be telling Carl's story as well here on the show because as far as we're concerned, Carl Hoffman is one of the most instrumental people when it comes to figuring out what actually happened to Michael.
The Asmats believe that death is never ever caused naturally. There's always a reason for it, and it's always at the will of the gods. Carl Hoffman wrote that there are 2 realms, the land of reality, which is where we are now, and then there is Safan, which is the land beyond the sea. Often a spirit would go to Safan, or they would be too scared to make the journey alone, so they would often return to the village and cause a ton of trouble for the people there. The Asmat people would build these poles, like the ones purchased by Michael, and perform rituals to keep the spirits away and force them to make the journey to Safan, where they are meant to be.
So, to recap, they build these sticks, and then they beat the people off the island into the ocean.
Nope.
Yep.
That's not how it goes.
Back down, stay down.
Comply. God. The ceremony would take 7 months, and usually in this time, after the pole is set, they would raid another village and take a few heads from the villagers to place onto the poles.
It's worse than I thought.
No, it gets worse. But, I don't know. I always try to withhold judgment because remember that these people, they've been isolated for, the whole time they've been in existence. So they've completely made up their own rules without any Western influence whatsoever. So this is just an entirely grown culture alone. So the things that they do might seem odd, like beheading others and putting them on poles.
We're all raised on the puritanically oppressive standards of Western culture.
They had none of that.
No.
So they did things a bit different down there than we do over here. So anyway, they would also infuse blood from the villagers into the poles, and as these things rotted, the remains would go into the ground and feed the sago plants. Sago is just a plant that's native to the area. We'll mention that a few times. It was a staple in the village there. This would make the spirit happy, and they would return to Safan, and life in the village would again be in balance. Balance is incredibly important to the Asmat people, and it's actually very important to the story.
We must restore balance to the empire.
But the Asmat people were not like Darth Vader. We have to make sure you guys know.
I sense a disturbance in the force.
There was a disturbance.
If the Asmat people were to kill someone, they preferred to kill a person that they know and whose name they know because they would often consume the corpse afterward and absorb their name and their soul, becoming them. I want to be you.
We've come a long way because now when people do things like that, they don't so often consume them, but they just use their skin and make suits.
Or they just steal their social security number.
Okay, there's that too. That's better.
I want to be you.
It's not as bad as their skin. We've gone a step further even than I remembered. I'm still into like the Buffalo Bill phase of the world, I guess.
It puts the lotion on the skin.
It lets the Joe dirt out of the hole. Sorry.
Just give me your PIN number and your debit card and we'll call it good.
Will do. From what I understand, the Asmat tribes consisted of 2 neighboring villages who were constantly at war with one another. The villages of Amadasep and Ochnep. It would seem from our research that when Michael had visited the Asmat tribe for the first time, he went to the village of Amadasep. We also know that the Asmat still practiced the ancient custom of cannibalizing those that they killed, along with headhunting.
I will eat your heart. One day, in 1957, almost 4 years prior to the arrival of Michael and the documentary crew, some men from the village of Amadasep invited men from Ochnep to make a voyage with them to the Dougal River within the island. If they were always at war with one another, I'm not sure why they went along with the voyage, but it doesn't matter what I think, because they did join them, and the villagers and the voyagers from both villages departed as planned. And you guessed it, it's a trap!
It was a trap.
It was a trick.
The whole time I was reading about that, I was like, no, don't go in there.
Behind you!
Run.
The invitation was meant for nothing more than to lead the men of Ochnep away from their village, where they would be attacked. An extremely ferocious battle broke out between all of the men, who'd have thought, out in the middle of nowhere. And in total, 124 Asmat men left between the 2 villages, and only 11 men returned to the villages.
It was a big deal.
You're driving a bus. 124 Asmat men get on, but only 11 get off. What color are the bus driver's eyes?
It was a demon. Anyway.
Well, you're driving the bus, so yeah, it kind of is.
I really set myself up there, didn't I? So now that you have somewhat of a tiny look into how the Asmat tribe works, let's get back to Michael. Imagine his excitement at this point. He made it to Dutch New Guinea and made a documentary. He experienced life and culture beyond anything he had ever known because not only was this kid from New York City, he was a Rockefeller, and he grew up sitting directly on the lap of luxury. From his photos, he looked to be having the time of his life. He was smiling, interacting, helping with chores and daily duties. The idea that I get from looking at him is that he is getting the most out of the experience that he possibly can.
Not only all of that, but he also accomplished his main goal that included visiting the Asmat tribe and purchasing some of their art to bring back home for his father's museum.
At this point, the documentary is wrapping up and they're talking about packing it up and going home in a few days. Michael decided to take this opportunity to return to the Asmat village for a slightly longer visit before they left, and he still needed to collect the things that he had purchased from them. At some point during his presence in Dutch New Guinea, he had met an officer who had a homemade vessel that was basically designed to easily navigate the rivers of the area. The officer's name was Vin van de Waal, and Michael talked him into selling him the boat.
Dutch New Guinea officials weren't really all that happy about Michael running around from village to village among unfamiliar tribes who had been known to be very dangerous in the past. Although they were working on releasing the territory and putting it under the control of another country and had been saying that the Asmat people were a very progressive up-and-coming culture and that they no longer practice headhunting and cannibalism, even though we know that to be untrue. Nonetheless, they didn't really like him running around by himself, so they assigned him a guide named Rene Wassing.
So Michael, Rene, and 2 other local men took off in Michael's new boat, bound for the village of Amadasep. When they were approximately 12 miles off the shore of the village, the waves and current became too much for the vessel, and they flipped it over in shark-infested water. It sounds like from here, Michael and Rene climbed up on top of the boat while the other 2 local men went for help. Now keep in mind that these 2 men had to swim 12 miles and then run to the nearest village that they knew, so this was going to take them quite a while. Michael and Rene floated for close to 24 hours before Michael started to get impatient.
According to Rene Wassing, Michael stood up and strapped 2 empty gas tanks to his waist to help him stay afloat in case he got tired. He was ready to swim the 12 miles to shore, and I can't really say that I blame Michael. The smart thing to do would be to stay in your boat. Everyone knows that that is what you do. But I can't imagine myself sitting there for 24 hours, being able to see land in the distance and being extremely tempted to go for it. Although, I'm sure the land looked a lot closer than it actually was.
Objects in the mirror appear closer than they are.
They talked about it a bit, and Rene decided that he would, in fact, remain in the boat. He was a lot older than Michael, and he didn't really think that he would make it to shore swimming it out. It's reported that Michael, ready with the gas can strapped to his waist, bid Rene a final farewell. He was staring at the land in the distance, and just before he jumped in the water, he said, "I think I can make it." And those were the last words anyone ever heard uttered from the mouth of Michael Rockefeller. Rene lost sight of him after a while, and was never sure if he made it to shore or not, but he was never found or seen again.
I think it was reported that Rene Wassing remained floating for another 24 hours before the two men returned with help from the village and he was rescued. He had told them what happened with Michael, and when he wasn't found at any of the nearby villages, the people returned to alert the Dutch government that an American tourist had gone missing.
Immediately, the Dutch alerted the United States, and the Rockefellers were hit with this terrible news.
Now wait, I say immediately, but actually I found out later on that it actually took 3 days for the news to reach Nelson Rockefeller. So there was a 3-day period in there where he had no idea, and there was only a small search going on before that.
And then at that point, Nelson and Michael's twin sister Mary made the trip to New Guinea to see for themselves what was going on with Michael. They were not immediately allowed to go into Asmat because since the Dutch government had already just lost someone in that area, they felt it was too dangerous to send more in, which is reasonable.
Makes total sense.
However, an enormous search for Michael did take place. There were reporters, patrol planes, boats, helicopters, and a whole lot of people scouring the island for him.
And those things didn't start till after Nelson got there, obviously, because he's a Rockefeller and he hired anybody and everybody to come find him.
I get what I want.
That's right. Which, is his kid and stuff, so I don't blame him one bit. But there was really just a small sweep of the area before Nelson got there. Finally, the man who sold Michael the boat. He also happened to be a patrol officer in the direct area of Asmat, and he heard that the Rockefellers were made to stay so far away from the area and that they really wanted to be involved. So he volunteered to let them stay with him, much closer to the area in which Michael went missing. The man's name was Ben Vandeval, and he was the same age as Michael.
The search lasted about 2 weeks before the officials called it off in November of 1961. Everything died down. The helicopters, boats, and planes all left except for a few stragglers who didn't give up right away. Nelson and Mary had to travel back to New York City, back to Michael's mother and other siblings empty-handed. They didn't know any more about the whereabouts of Michael than they did when they had arrived, and absolutely no trace of him had been found anywhere.
The death of Michael was assumed, and his death was ruled a drowning, officially. And there were a great many people who believed this to be true. Not only was the 12-mile swim a treacherous one, but the water that Michael had gone into was known to be infested with sharks. It was really a plausible explanation for him to disappear without a trace.
They went home and resumed their lives the best they could. Life in New Guinea seemed to resume as well, although Michael was fading to the back of their minds as they went about their busy day in the villages. And then, out of nowhere, in March, 4 months later, newspapers internationally were suddenly reporting that there was information about Michael. They were reporting that it had been discovered that Michael had been killed by a group of local men off the southwest coast of New Guinea, outside of Ochnep, and subsequently eaten by the people there.
Apparently, a Dutch missionary who had been living in Asmat heard the rumors from the local people and wrote home to his parents about it. His parents, instead of taking the letter to the police detectives who were working the case, decided to leak it to the newspaper instead. Michael going missing had been one of the biggest stories of the time, so when this letter came about, the papers took it and ran. Ultimately, the world found out about this before the family and the cops did, and Michael's family read the news that he had been eaten by cannibals in the newspaper instead of private conversations as they would have deserved.
People are despicable.
They are.
Obviously, Nelson and Michael's family wanted to know if there was any truth about what was being said here, and what else was known. The Dutch embassy in New York then sent a telegram to the Dutch ambassador asking him what was going on. The ambassador quickly replied via telegram stating that the rumors had been investigated already and that there was absolutely no truth to this whatsoever and there was no proof of it to boot. As far as they're concerned, Michael is still considered to be missing and they do not think that he had been eaten by cannibals as there had not been practice of cannibalism in New Guinea for a very long time, so they say.
Lies. The ambassador sent this letter on March 28th of 1962, and according to author Carl Hoffman, this is the same day that an investigation will be launched into the rumors, so it seems odd that they would say that they had already investigated it when the investigation had actually begun on that very day. And we already know that the tribes in New Guinea were still practicing cannibalism and that it was an ancient custom and a huge part of their very important rituals.
So apparently, there's a lot more to the story than what meets the eye, and Carl Hoffman, who had been investigating Michael's disappearance for his book, Savage Harvest, was determined to get to the bottom of it. Through his investigation, he figured out that there were actually 2 priests living in Asmat and acting as missionaries there, and they had lived there for about 6 years. They spoke the local language and were comfortable among the people, dressing like them, participating completely in everyday goings-on, dressing up, and helping with the rituals. So after all this time there and being completely immersed in the culture, they probably started making some friends and seemed to have been pretty much absorbed into the tribe.
After a few years of being there, they had begun to hear rumors and small bits of a story regarding an American tourist who had been killed in the village. Over time, they would hear more and more of the story, and after they had the complete tale, they each wrote back to the Catholic Church a very detailed report on what they had heard. Carl states that they even reported specific names of the men involved in the killing and could tell them who had which bone, as Michael seems to have been spread all over the village and his various long bones taken as trophies. The report even named the man who stabbed Michael through the chest with a spear.
After the Dutch had received this report, they sent a patrol officer into the area to investigate these claims, and whatever they found out didn't really matter because they seemed to have resolved to tell the Rockefellers that they hadn't found anything, whether they had or not.
Carl did end up speaking to one of the priests and received the same story from him many years later. The most interesting thing of all is that he managed to secure an interview with a man named Vin Vanderval. Remember him? He was the guy who sold Michael the boat and allowed Nelson and Mary to stay with him so that they could be closer to the search effort and in the area where Michael disappeared. Vin had a lot to say.
He had lived in the area and patrolled Asmat for quite some time. He felt perfectly comfortable among the people and reported to Carl that he had never felt that they were dangerous or threatening to him at all. It was a totally relaxed relationship and he didn't fear them or have any trouble with them.
When Carl sat down with Vin Vanderval to talk to him about the incident, Vin told Carl a story that would become significant later on in Carl's quest for information about Michael. There was another patrol officer in the area named Max Lepre. Max had come from a colonial family, and he had come to the area without a lot of knowledge about the people. He had been in prison at some point for an unknown reason, and seemed to be uncomfortable around the Asmat people. The way that Max is described as a person makes me think that he was kind of a very uptight, authoritarian, bully type figure, and it seems that he was intimidated and even somewhat fearful of a culture that he didn't understand. Vin told Carl that Max wanted to teach the Asmat a lesson for a long time.
So, remember that battle that we talked about earlier in the show? The one where men from Ochnep tricked the men from Omadasep in order to attack them? After this happened, Patrol Officer Max Lepre decided that this was his opportunity to teach the Asmat that lesson. He gathered up men, including indigenous men from other local tribes and villages, and took a large group into the village of Ochnep, and he had a battle on his mind. The men that followed Max were armed with machine guns. As he got closer to the village, Max began to feel intimidated and fearful about what would happen, and obviously going into something like this with fear and nervousness is not a good idea. As you can imagine, they marched into this village with their machine guns in hand, pointing them at the Asmat people and yelling. The first wrong move by the Asmat happened, and the nervous, fearful machine gun-toting men immediately opened fire on them.
I was reading after I wrote this that there was another article that described that battle pretty well, and basically I was thinking that the Asmat moved to kind of attack them, but it actually sounds more like it was a cultural misunderstanding. Like they were really just trying to be peaceful and find out what they wanted, and ended up making the guys nervous, so it was completely senseless.
This situation ended up causing the death of 5 Asmat men. 4 of which, no, it's your turn.
You can go.
Okay. This situation ended up causing the death of 5 Asmat men, 4 of which happened to be very important men within the village, tribal leaders. After this happened, Max and his men continued to threaten the tribe for a little bit longer before retreating. There was nothing that the Asmat people could do against machine guns, so there was no retribution or ability to fight back, and this left their universe completely out of balance. Remember we talked about that earlier, that in order to have balance, there must be some sort of retribution for wrongdoings against them. The murders of the Asmat men were not reciprocated.
After the meeting with Vin Vanderval, Carl decided that the only thing to do was to go to Dutch New Guinea and visit the Asmat village himself to see what information he could dig up there. It took him 9 days to get there, and when he arrived in New Guinea, he found a couple of guides and an interpreter to go with him to the village because Carl was unable to speak any of the languages there. He had a plan to go into the village under the guise of a journalist who wanted to write about the Asmat culture. He went almost his entire visit without even mentioning the name Michael Rockefeller. He spent most of his time staying in a nearby village called Basim, and met a man named Kokai, who would be important to Carl later on. Kokai was actually the head man for the village of Ochnep, and he happened to be in Basim at the same time that Carl was. So Carl ended up going with him into Ochnep as well.
Carl states that from the beginning, the people of Ochnep were very closed off and they were not welcoming at all. While they didn't threaten him in any way, they didn't smile or greet him or seem to be particularly pleased that he was there either. They did gather with him and tell stories, but every time they would get into too much detail regarding their culture or any stories that they had to tell, they would clam up and not really say anything. After a while, they seemed to stop talking to him and even his indigenous translator completely, and no one from the village had mentioned Michael. Until one day.
One day he was talking to his translator about the problems that they were having communicating with the people in Ochnep, and the fact that they wouldn't seem to open up to Carl. Carl's translator told him it's because the people are afraid. So of course, Carl wanted to know what they're afraid of, and his translator told him that they were afraid because a long time ago there was an American tourist named Michael Rockefeller who was killed in the village. Apparently, it's a commonly told story in the village, as the translator told Carl that he was told the story as a boy by his father. The translator told Carl that the people were afraid that he was here to ask questions about Michael.
At that point, Carl felt comfortable enough with this man to tell him the truth. He went ahead and admitted to the man that he was actually there to do just that. The man became excited and wanted to help Carl as much as he could, so they kept it a secret, and the translator would go around the village without Carl, trying to see if he could find anything out. 2 months into Carl's visit, the most that they had found out is that the local people are saying that Michael was killed by the Asmat people, but they hadn't really found any more detail on the killing. Carl had been there for too long and felt that even though they didn't know much about it, he was satisfied enough to have found out that Michael was killed and hadn't just drowned or been eaten by sharks off the coast.
Carl went home and began to write his novel, Savage Harvest. He wrote for a couple of months and then he states that one day he just stopped. He had been thinking about his visit to New Guinea and his interaction with the Asmat people there, and he felt that he regretted everything about the way he had conducted it. He felt that he went about it in a way that seemed suspicious from the start to the Asmat people, asking way too many questions about their culture, and he didn't spend enough time just being with them on a personal level and interacting with them. He felt that he gave a bad impression and felt that he had no other choice but to return and try again, going about things completely differently.
He started taking lessons to learn Indonesian so that he could communicate with them himself and not take so many outside people with him. He went back to New Guinea 7 months later. He states that he was received so differently this time. I think that the fact that he came back for another visit made them already feel more comfortable and open. He was greeted with smiles and with familiarity, and was even able to stay with the head man of the village, Kokai, who he had met on the previous trip. He did things differently this time, just living among them, interacting with them, helping with chores and rituals, and got to know them. At some point in his long visit, he pulled out some photos of the Asmat people that had been taken by Michael. The people got very excited and recognized them immediately. They started talking about Michael and his time there with them, and the story began to come out.
The Asmat people told Carl that Michael had in fact made it to shore that day. He was exhausted from swimming, and as he came up on land, he was met by a group of Asmat men and taken into the village. Unfortunately, it sounds like Michael may have been just in the wrong place at the wrong time in a way. He had come into the village of Ochnep, where things were still severely out of balance. These men were still looking for retribution for the men who had been killed by Max Lepre a few years before Michael had even arrived.
The Asmat men who were killed had been leaders, so other members of the tribe had respectfully consumed their bodies, taking in their souls and their positions as leaders within the village. These particular men, who had taken the places of the slain men, were called into action, and Michael was seen as a chance to restore balance within their universe. They didn't hate him, and he had done nothing wrong. To them, it was just an obligatory action that had to be performed, and just a way of life. Sadly, Michael was held by the men while one of them took a spear and drove it through Michael's chest, and another hit him in the back of the head with an axe, ending his life. The 4 Asmat men had been killed by white men, and now they had achieved their retribution and balance by killing a white man.
Over the course of the next few days, Michael was cooked and consumed by these men in a ritual. A pole was made for him and he was placed in the sago fields, infused with his blood. His long bones were distributed to important tribal members throughout the village, and the smaller ones had been made into small weaponry and arrowheads. His blood would be smeared over their bodies during the rituals, but the fallout for this was difficult for the Asmat people. The search that ensued took over the area with helicopters and planes, and it scared them badly. The secret had to be kept, and it was for a very long time. But after it was all over, balance was again in place in Ochnep. Retribution had happened, and all was well within the village. Death comes for us all, even for kings it comes.
There were a couple of writers who even took different expeditions into the Asmat villages hoping to find answers. Another writer besides Carl Hoffman, of course, was a man named Milt Macklin, and his trip resulted in a documentary that I kept reading about in my research but could never actually find it anywhere to watch it. I think it had been on Netflix for a time, but isn't now. His story was told, though, on an old episode of In Search Of, so I at least got the general idea of what Macklin came to discover. Macklin was initially approached by a man who wouldn't even tell him his real name, but only addressed himself as Donahue. He told Macklin that he had seen and spoken to Michael a few months back on an island called Kanapu, and that he was very much alive. This was enough to send Macklin heading over to New Guinea to see for himself what was going on.
You make it sound like a short drive. Heading on over to New Guinea.
Heading on over. Hop in the hybrid. And by hybrid, I mean duck boat.
Yeah, those things are awesome.
Donahue.
Who picks a name like Donahue? If I'm going to come up with a
Deep
spy
throat.
name. Yeah. They really come up with some good ones. I think of the talk show host.
Right.
Remember when we were kids? Donahue?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
Donahue said that Michael had been found by an indigenous war party and taken with them over 1,000 miles by canoe to the Trobriand Islands. Macklin found Kanapu Island by hiring a boat when he got there and sailing to the tiny place in the middle of the vast ocean. Only, when he arrived, Michael was nowhere to be seen. He subsequently went back to New Guinea and spent another 2 months there. He heard rumor after rumor there about Michael being killed and eaten by the natives.
So I think we can conclude through 2 expeditions by different authors that they've
got eaten.
Right. That sounds to be what happened. And there's lots of different theories on the internet. If you take to the web, the interwebs, you'll find that, most people are so sure that he had drowned, so sure that he had been eaten by sharks. But only 2 people went there. They went to Papua New Guinea. That Carl Hoffman spent 4 months total there trying to figure out what happened. So I take their word over everyone else's. Sounds like they're pretty conclusive. So one of my biggest questions throughout the whole time doing the research for this episode, and I assume you've asked yourself this question as well, why did the Dutch ambassador lie about the investigation and what really happened to Michael? And the answer is simple. They were trying to cover it up. It turns out that Michael had just happened to go missing at a very bad time. The United East India Company had control of the island, and just before this incident, the Dutch had begun taking the whole thing over. They were fighting the UN for complete control, basically by stating that they had taken the island under their wing and they had civilized the people there. They were the ones that were telling the UN that headhunting and cannibalism weren't a thing anymore in the area, but they actually were. They just wanted control of the area. So they said that to make themselves look good, like they'd kind of settled the place down. They were the ones who put Max Lepre in charge of the area, and he had just gunned down 5 of their people. And now the son of one of the world's wealthiest elites had been eaten by them. So, not only did the Dutch not want to lose control of the area, they were also ashamed of what had come to happen under their watch.
So, that's the story of Michael Rockefeller as we know it. My take from the descriptions and photos of Michael are that he was truly adventurous, kind, and an interesting person with a lot to offer the world. And it's tragic that his life was taken so horribly, especially when he was only there because he was so interested in the culture of these extremely interesting people. There are a lot of people who will speak badly of the Asmat people and other isolated tribes that still exist all over the world, but we have to carefully remember that the way they saw this killing, and probably others that they had performed, was that it was one of spiritual obligation. It wasn't an action taken from hate or anger, and their beliefs are important. When we go to someone else's territory or home, we live by their rules, and this can be dangerous, especially if we don't fully understand it.
We want to sincerely thank you for listening to Bigfoot for Breakfast this week, and we certainly do hope that you'll be back next week as we discuss a strange new topic. Don't forget to push that subscribe button so you can be notified every Tuesday when we upload new episodes, and leave us a rating and a review on whichever podcast platform that you're listening from, because this really helps us out, and we enjoy hearing from you guys. Make sure that you email us or leave us a voicemail if you have something to say. If you leave a voicemail, please include at least your first name and where you're from in the message, and we'll air it on next week's show. The number to call is 641-812-2634. Until next week.
Bye.
Bigfoot for Breakfast out.
Drop it like it's hot.